That's fine. Okay, so our next speaker is Patrick Gaulme, who's going to be telling us about the magnetic activity of red giant stars, and I'll give you a 3-minute one.
All right. Okay, so yeah, the purpose of my presentation is to try and bringing some new light on the magnetic activity of red giant stars, which is a small population that has been observed for a while. So first of all, I will present, it's a preamble, I will talk about active red giants in eclipsing binaries I've worked on a few years ago that led me to work on investigating the nature of the population of red giants with surface magnetic fields. So yeah, first of all, as most of us know, red giants, eclipsing binaries are special astrophysical objects of interest because it is we can easily measure the mass and radius of both components, model-free mainly. And so it was back in 2013, I wanted to check the accuracy of asteroseismology for red giants by measuring the mass and radius of red giant and eclipsing binaries for which we have oscillations. And this type of system is quite rare. Today we have 20 oscillating red giants in double-line spectroscopic binaries. And so I used to dedicate a lot of attention to each candidate. It was all light curves observed by Kepler. And there was this small group of stars. I could not find the oscillations of the red giants. I was quite upset about it. I thought, you know, maybe I'm not processing the light curves as I should, but they didn't seem fundamentally different with respect to the others. And I probably cursed the light curves quite a lot until I figured out there was something more in that. There was something actually connecting red giant activity, the tides, and the oscillations. So all of those are related. So here are a few figures that show what I'm saying. This is, for who's not familiar with oscillations of stars, so this is the power spectrum of a photometric time series, 4 years of Kepler data. The x-axis, the frequency in microhertz, and here is the power. So the power spectrum of the time series, and the oscillations. I don't know if my mouse is visible, but it's this bunch of peaks at about 30 microhertz. So a bunch of peaks that are evenly spaced in frequency. So today we have in Kepler data 35 red giants in eclipsing binaries, and half of them show this typical oscillation pattern, really nice, and about 20% show some weaker oscillations. We have 7 of them. We still see some oscillations at the same kind of range, but much lower signal-to-noise ratio. And the star is not fainter, right? It's the same kind of magnitude. And in 10 cases, excuse me, out of 35, they don't show any oscillation at all. And I figured out it was not randomly distributed, this. It was not happening randomly. Because on the other hand, we had this nice oscillating red giants in eclipsing binaries. This is an extract of the light curve. We see 2 eclipses. It's a main sequence star and the red giant star. And between oscillations, there's mainly nothing. It's flat. To the contrary, there are some targets where the eclipse photometry is much smaller than the variability. So there's rotational modulation, which is very large, can reach 10% in average. So the SPH, the photometric index, which is a standard deviation of the light curve, can reach 10%. And it happens that the stars with no oscillation are in the second group with very large variability. So what we showed, so back in 2014, and there's an update paper by Bombakura 2021 that shows new results, but it's an update. So distant binaries, where let's say the period is longer than 100, 120 days, nothing significant is observed. So the red giant oscillate normally and nothing special. When we are at periods that are between 50 and 100 days, we see variability, quite large, but we still see oscillations. They are weak, but we still see some. And then in very close binaries, there's very large activity and no oscillations. And most of it, there's a synchronization. So the orbital period is equal to the rotation period. The qualitative interpretation we did is, okay, red giants are spun up by tidal forces, and because they're big, so on short orbits, they're spun up, and the dynamo kicks off. And we know pressure waves don't propagate well in big spots, even on the sun, and the convection is slightly reduced by magnetic field. So altogether leading to weaker oscillation and even no oscillation at all when it's very strong. So two years later, some colleagues showed me some Likers. It was Kepler Likers of red giants. And there was a very strong rotational modulation. And in some cases, very small oscillations, like on the left. And in some cases, no oscillation at all. And it reminded, there were like 80 Likers exactly like this. And it reminded me these Eclipsing binaries with active red giants, these closed binaries. And the modulation period are about 50 days. So it was consistent. I thought, oh, well, they must all be non-eclipsing binaries. So the same as I had, but with no eclipses. And that's what led me to try to figure out how true this is and how many binaries are among the active red giants, and then to understand in more general way where do come from these active red giants. So by digging into the literature, I found out there's a bunch of studies about active red giants. Here are a few references, there are some others, but very basically, sorry, I have a throat ache. The low mass, so below the Kraft break, solar mass stars that have a convective envelope during the main sequence should not display surface magnetic field during the red giant phase, just because they slow down during the main sequence, and then when they end the main sequence, they are slow rotator. And when they expand during the red giant branch, it even gets worse. So there's no reason for these stars to be active in principle. And then intermediate mass star that have a radiative envelope during the main sequence are not expecting to spin down, to slow down during the main sequence. So they are expected, if they are fast rotated during the main sequence, to keep being fast rotators in red giant branch and on the red clump, even though it slows down, but so we expect them to be active. There are observations from spectroscopy, in particular by Karlberg et al. 2011, that show that about 2% of red giants show V sin I, so the equatorial rotation, projected equatorial rotation speed over 10 kilometers per second, which is considered to be large for a red giant star. And on the other hand, there's Kepler observations and this paper by Cellier et al. 2017 that showed that about 2% of red giants show rotational modulation. Oh, so note that these 2% and 2% are not in principle connected together, even though we know the faster they rotate, the higher the dynamo is, the more active they are. But there's no strict reason to think that 10 kilometers per second leads to 2% of photometric variation. But the result, the final, I mean, by putting all of that together, there is a mismatch between theory and observations, because low mass red giants are actually more, in these studies, it's mostly low mass red giants that are active. According to Teya 2015 and Cellier 2017, they found that about 10% of solar mass red giants show surface activity. And to the contrary, they could not identify the sample of intermediate mass stars that are active. I mean, just a few of them, but not a significant fraction. So, but the goal of this work was to give a new look to that by a self-consistent approach, because the spectroscopic data that were taken were not meant for being associated with the Kepler observations, and vice versa. There were no dedicated spectrometric observations for that. And I noticed also some possible biases in the analysis of Kepler data. So that's why just selection samples. That's why I wanted to do a self-consistent approach to give a new look at that by combining asteroseismology and high resolution spectroscopy, mostly for getting radial velocities. So I wanted to make sure to be able to detect oscillations if there are oscillations. For example, Cellier et al. 2017 considered all the red giants that were observed by Kepler, that there were about 17,000 at the time, the estimate of red giants, and found that 2% are active. The problem is that many of them are very faint. So at some point, you're limited by this. And Gaulme et al. 2019 looked for how many red giants oscillate in the Kepler field and found that 92% oscillate and 8% do not oscillate. Again, they considered all the stars, and a lot of them are very faint. And Mosser in 2019 quantified, is very useful, the photon noise limit on Kepler, K2, and test data. So it allows us to know when we can detect oscillations if a star oscillates as it should, in general, it does. So I wanted to be not biased by these kind of things. So I focused only on Kepler data because there's the longest one with the best photometry, magnitude less than 12.5, and duration of observations more than 3 years. And also I wanted to be able to identify the oscillations. If they are too big, the frequency of the oscillations is very low in the range, and they may be mixed up with rotation peaks. It's sometimes hard to say if a star oscillates. And when they're very large, when it's very small star, the frequency are large and out of the Nyquist frequency, the frequency range accessible from Kepler data. So I didn't want to have such kind of problems and limited myself to 4 to 15 solar radii, which is basically the mainstream red giants that Kepler observed and the best targets, because I mean, if you want a reference red giant from Kepler, you should pick one of those. They are bright and observed for a long time and everything. So it's about 4,500 red giants in the end. What did we measure? So actually it's 4,465 red giants. And we found, that's the first result, we found oscillations in 99.3% of the sample. Gaulme was reporting 92. The main reason is because we limited ourselves to the bright targets. So we were able to measure nu max and delta nu for those. So nu max is the mean frequency of the oscillations, and delta nu is the frequency spacing of the oscillations, and altogether plus effective temperature informations leads to an estimate of the mass and the radius of a star. We measured the amplitude of the oscillation, of course, and also the mixed mode spacing, which indicates the pure spacing of the mixed modes of the red giant. It allows us to distinguish a hydrogen shell burning star from a helium core burning star, so the red giant branch versus the red clump. And we could do that for 3,400 red giants. So this is the figure I'm showing here. Delta nu on top and delta pi on the y-axis. And the group on the top is the red clump, so burning helium in the core, and the under is the red giant branch. We detected activity for 370 targets. So it means 8%, more or less, of the sample, while Cellier was reporting 2%. In particular, I guess, again, for this problem of magnitude and the selection of the stars. And we computed V sin I, but V sin 90 degrees because we have the radius and the rotation period. So it's useful to compare them to a spectroscopic result. And so we did it as a dedicated pipeline, and I controlled by eye every single star. So I'm quite confident in the result. So this is the main first diagram where we show here the amplitude of the oscillations versus the frequency, the new max, frequency at maximum amplitude, the mean frequency of the oscillations. All these tiny little points, I don't know if we see them, the little dots, the gray ones are all the red giants. The darker dots, it's when the L=1 modes, so the dipole mode, are depleted. I'm talking about acoustic modes, I'm not magnetic. So acoustic modes are depleted, and all the active red giants, that show rotational modulation, surface activity spots, are in red or blue. What you can see from there is that the amplitude of these oscillations of the active ones is in average much smaller than for a regular red giant. So this is consistent with previous observations that connects surface activity leads to lower, weaker oscillations. Now, let's take a look at binarity. What is the binary fraction among this sample? We took a high-resolution spectra at Apache point, so 85 active red giants, including all of the non-oscillating ones. There were 32. And there was a sample of 212 inactive red giants observed by Apogee. And we looked at variation of radial velocity. And the first interesting result is that the non-oscillating ones, so those that have absolutely no oscillations, they are practically all closed binaries, except 2 or 3 cases where it's unsure because the rotation is so wide that we cannot really see a motion of the radial velocity. Then among the active red giants with oscillations, with weak oscillations, but with oscillation, there's still a significant fraction of closed binaries inside. It's about 15%. But it's not dominant. 85% of this sample is not composed of eclipsing binaries. So what is that? What is that? We took our mixed mode analysis, the mass, the radius, so the evolutionary status. We classified the red giant branch versus the red clump, and we made histograms. So this is in white, both panels. In white is the histogram of all the inactive giants, the regular giants.
3 minutes, Patrick.
And yes, thank you. And in red and green, it's the distribution of the active red giant branch, red, and red clump in green. So let's focus on the green histogram. You can see that it's bimodal. There's a group at 1 solar mass and a group that starts at 1.5 and ends at 3 solar masses. So there's a solar mass and intermediate mass stars. What we can measure is what is the total fraction of active stars for each group. So for the solar mass, you have about 3% of active stars in the red giant branch, but it rises up to 12% of the red clump solar mass stars. For intermediate mass stars, over 50% of the red giant branch intermediate mass stars are active, and 25% in the red clump, meaning that in the case of solar mass, there's a gain, an average gain of angular momentum from the red giant branch to the red clump. For the intermediate mass star, is the opposite. So first of all, we confirm that there's about 10% of active low mass solar mass red giants, and we identify for the first time this sample of active intermediate mass red giants that was not identified by Selye et al., for example. But let's take a look at the V sin I, and it explains some stuff about spectroscopic observations. So overall, about 1.4% of the red giants that we have a V sin 90 larger than 10 kilometers per second. So it's pretty comparable to what Kalbeck found, 2%, but you know, samples are different, not necessarily the same region. So it's not inconsistent. It's not absolutely consistent, but it's close. All RGB stars have a V sin I between 3 and 10 kilometers per second. But what is strange is that the solar mass have V sin I up to 15 kilometers per second, which is quite large, while the intermediate mass stars that are active have a V sin I peaking at 4 or 5 kilometers per second. So we confirm and we don't confirm what was observed before. Yes, there are not many stars with more than V sin I equal to 10, which is what we would expect from theory. But on the other hand, these stars are active. They are only 4 kilometers per second, but they are active. They have a lot of activity. So I'm going to show a last plot, which is the photometric index, the variability, the amplitude of the variability. What we show is that the stars, so that's the photometric index on Y and the rotation period on X. It shows that basically the binaries, even at the same rotation period, let's take at 40 days, they are spun up, of course, they all rotate in 40 days. But if it is in binary, the variability is much larger than if it's a single star. And for now, I have no explanation really for that. So to summarize the findings, 99.3% of red giants oscillate. It's the first, I mean, it's pretty good to know. 8% show surface activity. It's not that small. It's a small group, but it's not negligible. 15% are enclosed binaries of these active stars. And 85% are single stars. So why are these single star active? So the small one, the 10% that are active, the solar mass, one explanation that we can find in literature is probably the engulfment of merging. So engulfment of planets or merging with stars, because it would give some spin to the stars. And it would explain also why there are more active giants in the clump than in the red giant branch, because it would happen at the tip of the red giant branch. While intermediate mass star lose momentum, so it's logical to have less active red clump than red giant branch. But still, there is sink of angular momentum. We don't explain why there are so few that are not active. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to let you with a few open questions, which are why SPH, the photometric index, is larger for a red giant in a binary than a single one. Why V sin I is still quite low for intermediate mass star. And I haven't said that before, but there are some lithium-rich stars, but it doesn't seem to be connected to any of the categories, binaries or single or low mass or high mass. So we're planning on more spectroscopic observations and maybe Zeeman Doppler imaging in the future for the brightest. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Patrick. So if there are any quick questions.
Yeah, hi, Sami here. Very nice talk. I enjoyed that a lot. A question about your red giants, which you showed, I think, in the previous slide, where you said that the binary ones and closed binaries, no, the one before that, show much, no, the one after this.
This one?
No,
this one.
The one with the variability, exactly. That,
yes, okay.
That these show much larger variability. This is variability in total brightness?
Yes, it's the intensity of Kepler. So you take the standard deviation of the light curve.
Right.
Over five rotational periods, that's how it's defined, actually.
Right. And are these closed binaries, are they locked? Is the
We
rotation
suspect we don't have
period?
We don't have this information yet, but I suppose because that's what was observed in the eclipsing binaries. In the eclipsing binaries, those that have no oscillations are locked indeed.
Right. So could it just be that they are somewhat deformed?
They shouldn't be too deformed because it's still 20% of relative distance, and when you compute the Roche lobe and the evolutionary status, they're not that big. It shouldn't be that significant. Yeah, there's something on top of that. So an explanation could be there are, a few big spots, and we know on these that there are a few big spots, while on the single ones you could have plenty of small ones, and the result is less modulation. Doesn't mean the magnetic field is weaker. It could be influenced by the companion, probably.
Sure, yes, you're more likely to have active longitudes if you're in a closed binary. Sure. Yeah,
yes.
Thanks.
And a quick question from Renata.
Yes, thank you. Moment. Okay. Now you should see me.
Yes.
Well, Hello, Patrick. Nice to see you. I would like to say that you report for intermediate mass giants V sinus I of the order below 10 kilometers per second.
Yes.
But with our sample, published in Hurier et al. And Constantin Vantu et al., if you remember, we have giants with much more than single giants, I mean, which much more faster rotation than what you report by your study. And then maybe what about your conclusions? Because these stars could not be explained by, how to say, by just fast rotators on the main sequence. We tried this, but it is not possible because you explain intermediate mass giants with fast rotators on the main sequence. It is okay for stars up to 10 kilometers per second V sinus I on the base of the red giant branch, but our sample, we have more higher velocities than this.
Yeah, no, so we did a statistical study and we limited ourselves to a range of, there's a selection bias here too. I mean, we cut at 15 solar radii, and so I don't know, maybe it could be some mergers. I don't know. It's very interesting, yeah.
We tried to
So this is the result
explain.
of an average sample of regular red giants. So
they are not so fast like FK comma. They are not so fast like FK comma, but they are much, how to say, faster than what you found here. By the way, the same problem was with my solar vicinity sample. I don't know if you know about this. It is also about 50 red giants in the solar vicinity, where we couldn't find so fast rotators. We found something like your results.
Okay.
Sorry to cut off the conversation, but we're running a little bit behind, so I think we'll have to move on. But thank you again, Patrick, and maybe you can continue this